Okay, Michael, I think we'll get started now, and anyone who hasn't joined yet, they'll join later on, and they'll get the recording anyway. So,
Okay, thank you, Richard. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Gore, and I would like to welcome you to this webinar on identity and access management. We have just a few housekeeping points that I would like to raise. Thank you. So please submit your questions through a Q&A interface, which you will see, and the webinar is being recorded. We will email you a link to the recording at the end of after the event. We have with us today, there are three of us principally involved in today. There's Luciano Blanchard, who is Cloud Solutions Architect for Security and Identity at Microsoft. We should also have Oli Mozesi, but unfortunately, Oli has succumbed to the dreaded COVID, and so he can't be with us today. And then there's myself. My name is, as I say, is Michael Gore. I'm the head of Cobweb Customer Success. The point of today with all webinars is to inform and bring people to a position of understanding about whatever the relevant subject is, which is what we have today. So I think that we will move on to Luciano, who will take us through the rest of the presentation. As I mentioned earlier, please, if you've got any questions, put them in the chat, and we will address them at the end of the presentation, the webinar. Thanks very much.
Good morning, everybody. I'm really glad that you joined us today. I'm Luciana Blanchard. I'm a Cloud Solutions Architect in the Global Partner Solutions team here in the UK. And my focus is identity, and my role is to help partners build a security practice. Today, we will talk about modern security with a zero trust identity strategy. So our reality has changed. There has been a significant shift in security. The global pandemic has made remote working the norm for many organizations across the globe, and it's becoming a higher incentive. If you don't offer flexible work to your employees, you just can't get them to come and work for your company anymore. The employees are starting to demand that flexible work. And based on our surveys that Microsoft did, we know that 41% of employees for large companies around the world are looking for the opportunity to move jobs right now. And one of the biggest things that is going to motivate them to do this is, can they get a lifestyle and work style that work together and really meet their needs? Can they get that work-life balance to support their well-being and their family commitments? And this is a critical thing that all employers are having to deal with right now. We've got many organizations that now need to support permanent hybrid working models where secure access from outside the network is critical. And as employees transition to these new working models, they're bringing more device, which means there is a huge increase in endpoint diversity. And this makes visibility and threat detection and response across multiple platforms and clouds more challenging. So our traditional perimeter-based network and security models, they just can't adapt. We need a whole new model, and that's where zero trust comes into play. So the idea of the network perimeter, where you get to the office and you can only access your resources within that perimeter, it doesn't exist anymore because we see more cloud adoption, we see more mobile usage, we see more remote employees and contractors and partners. And all these people, they need access to your infrastructure, to your applications and your APIs in real time from outside of that perimeter. And just strengthening that old security perimeter, it doesn't really work because we can't just assume trust once you're in the network. A network is not necessarily the right place to say, now I trust this person. So if you're removing trust from the network, then we need to put it somewhere else. And if you look at how employees, partners, contractors, how they access resources, the idea is that identity is the new perimeter because they are the ones who you want to manage and control access to your resources. So the most effective way of doing this is shifting controls from your network layer to your application layer, because now we have a better idea of who the user is, what the device they're on, or location they're coming from, so we can make smarter decisions at the application layer. And organizations, they can utilize these identity signals as part of their access control decisions on when to grant access, when to deny access, and when to step up another additional factor in the authentication workflow. And that's what Zero Trust is all about. So Zero Trust is a set of security principles. The first principle it defines is verify explicitly. So always authenticate and authorize based on all your available data points, including your user identity, your location, your device health, your data classification, and any anomalies. And also verify continuously. So not only during the initial login, but frequently during the user session. Every time that identity token gets refreshed and any time that the security posture has changed. The second pillar is use least privilege access. So always adopt a least privilege approach. Just because I'm inside the corporate network, it doesn't mean that I should get access to everything. I should only be allowed to access the small number of applications that I need to get my job done. So don't give your users free access. And for very sensitive resources, you should enforce multi-factor authentication. And then make sure that the user is on a very well managed secure device that you know is in a good shape, that is compliant with your company's policies before you allow access to your privileged resources. And lastly, we have to always assume breach, because as good as your security is, we've got to assume that eventually an attacker will get in, and you need to have multiple layers of defense, and you need to have great monitoring and remediation in place so you can quickly figure out what's going on and take action. So the idea here is to minimize your blast radius by employing security strategies to prevent that lateral movement. So these are the pillars of our Zero Trust strategy. Microsoft solutions can really help you through each one of these pillars to really improve your security posture. A Zero Trust approach should extend throughout your entire digital state, and it should serve as an integrated security philosophy and an end-to-end strategy. But today, we will focus on identities. So identities can represent people, services, or even IoT devices. And when an identity attempts to access a resource, we need to verify that identity with strong authentication. We need to ensure that access is compliant and typical for that identity. So we need to ensure that that access request is not unusual, and we need to check for any anomalies. And we need to follow the least privilege access principles. So how can we do that? What can Microsoft security solutions do to help us with our Zero Trust journey? Before we deep dive on Microsoft security, one thing that I would like to get across is that there is this misconception that Azure AD is a Microsoft identity platform for Microsoft products. And that's not the case. It is an enterprise identity platform for Microsoft products, of course, but also for any SaaS application, any in-house built line of business applications, anything can be integrated with it. We support open standards such as OAuth and SAML. So this isn't just about Microsoft. This is about the wider ecosystem that you manage and you deploy to your users. So identity and security solutions from Microsoft, not just for Microsoft. Before we deep dive in the Microsoft solutions, I just want to mention the announcement that was made in Ignite a few weeks ago. Some of our products have been renamed. So Azure Sentinel is now called Microsoft Sentinel. Microsoft Cloud App Security, formerly MCAS, it's now called Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. Azure Defender and Azure Security Center, these are now called Microsoft Defender for Cloud. I will try my best to use the new names. If I make references to the old names, forgive me for that. I'm still getting used to these new names, just like you are. So this is the Microsoft Zero Trust lineup, and we do have the best lineup in the industry. We are the only company that can protect all your identities, all your devices, your applications, and all your data. We have Azure AD, so that's your identity platform. It provides you with single sign-on, strong authentication, multi-factor authentication, passwordless, conditional access, lots of features there. We've got Microsoft Defender for Identity to protect your on-premise domain controllers. We've got Microsoft Defender for Endpoints and Microsoft Intune to protect and manage your devices. We've got Microsoft Information Protection and Insider Risk Management to help you detect, investigate, and remediate potential misuse of data. And we've got Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, used to be called MCAS. So that's our CASB solution, which allows you to discover and control shadow IT within your organization. And at the bottom of this, we have Sentinel, our cloud native SIM. So all the signals from all these solutions, they go into Microsoft Sentinel. So now you can get a complete view across your state. You have visibility of everything that's going on, and you can have machine learning point out to you when there is unusual behavior and even automatically remediate potential security threats. So this lineup is the most comprehensive in the industry, and it can really help you advance as you move towards this new zero trust architecture. So the first thing that we look at when starting our zero trust journey is consolidating secure access to all applications, whether these are on-prem or in the cloud. And to achieve that, we use Azure AD. So Azure AD can easily synchronize with on-premises Active Directory, and it can also be connected to cloud HR systems. It can also can give access to external users, for example, partners using things like B2B and guest invitations. We have a lot of enterprise customers these days with workloads on multiple cloud providers. Many of them, they will have duplicate identities, for example, for their admin users. An admin might have an account in Azure AD, then another one in AWS, and maybe even a third one in Google Cloud Platform. They may even use the same passwords to make it easy to remember, right? And how do you solve this problem? How do you make this multi-cloud access more secure? So you can use Azure AD as your identity provider across all these cloud platforms to centralize your identities and extend the protection that Microsoft Cloud gives you to secure your whole multi-cloud environment. And with that, you can enable single sign-on, passwordless authentication, user sign-in risk analysis, conditional access, and you can do that to all your applications, including your AWS console and your Google Cloud Platform admin console for your developers and your administrators. So the next step is to ensure that only the right people on secure, compliant devices can access your data and your applications from anywhere. And to achieve these, we implement conditional access. So conditional access requires an Azure AD Premium P1 license. And how does this work? So conditional access takes in identity-related security signals, including user behavior, location, device state, applications, and then it determines the appropriate policy to apply for access to a resource, such as allowing, limiting, or blocking, or even implementing additional verification measures like stepping up multi-factor authentication. It gives you the power to enforce the core principle of zero trust, of never trust, always verify. So as an example, we have an admin user who is requesting access to Azure portal using an unmanaged device from a country that there are no company offices there. You can decide if you want to block that sign-in or if you want to step up the authentication and request multi-factor authentication. And you can create policies to secure your resources in many different ways. You can allow, for example, only admins to access your Azure portal from a compliant device, only from authorized locations that, for example, you've got a main office, maybe from countries where your admins are located. You can, for example, choose to block downloads and uploads from managed devices. So even if a user has access to your application, if the user is using an unmanaged device, he may not be able to upload or download or anything. And you can even go a step further and allow access to only view the information, but block access to copy, cut, paste, print to users from unmanaged devices, for example. And you can require multi-factor authentication when accessing high privilege resources like Azure Portal, or it could be even a payroll application or any application that you think it has sensitive data, for example. So it enables you to fine-tune access based on contextual user information, such as the user, the device, the state, and the location. You can take the level of protection that conditional access gives you to the next level by combining it with Azure AD identity protection. Identity protection uses Azure AD threat intelligence to determine user and sign-in risk. So it's all about automated risk detection and remediation. It uses the learnings that Microsoft has acquired from the position in organizations with Azure AD, the consumer space with Microsoft accounts, and in gaming with Xbox to protect your users. It can protect you from leaked credentials. When cybercriminals compromise users' passwords, they often post them on the web, or they might trade or sell these credentials in the black market. And when Microsoft leaked credential services acquires user credentials from the dark web or the sources, these are checked against Azure AD users' current valid credentials to find valid matches. And if that happens, then identity protection can automatically prompt the user to change his password. It can detect requests coming from anonymous IP addresses, for example. It could be Tor browser or anonymous VPN. And then these IP addresses, they are usually used by attackers who want to hide the telemetry. So they may want to hide their IP, the location, the device for malicious intent. And it can also detect impossible travel by identifying two sign-ins originating from geographically distant locations and then analyzing the time between the two sign-ins and the time it would have taken for the user to travel from the first location to the second. So as an example, could be an admin user requesting access to a sensitive application, could be a payroll application, and the user's previous sign-ins, let's say, have been from the UK. The last sign-in was from the UK 10 minutes ago. Now the user is requesting to log in from a different country with an anonymous IP address. So that would flag up as a risky sign-in. And then you could decide if you want to block that sign-in or if you may want to request multi-factor authentication. So conditional access and identity protection are two solutions that work together to complement each other. And identity protection requires Azure AD Premium P2 license. So we talked about consolidating access to your applications using Azure AD and single sign-on, then protecting access for any user from anywhere with conditional access and identity protection. Now we need to discuss the weakest link in the chain, which is passwords. So enabling multi-factor authentication is the single most important action that you can take into protecting your environment. If you're only going to do one thing to help protect your resources, it should be to turn on multi-factor authentication. It has shown to prevent up to 99% of identity attacks. But what I really want to emphasize with this slide is passwordless authentication. So most data breaches will involve weak, default, or stolen passwords. We know that users nowadays, they're great at creating complex passwords. We spent the last few decades telling them to use a combination of lowercase, uppercase, symbols, numbers, so they can come up with a really good, strong password. But the problem is that they then go and use the same password on every single account they have, because that's the only one they can remember. So passwords are breached constantly, and there are a number of studies and analytical data out there that backs this point up. Traditional MFA, multi-factor authentication, it is still the mainstream solution, but it's not necessarily the most user-friendly or convenient solution. We have a broad range of authentication options. For best customer experience on a PC, we recommend you use Windows Hello. It uses biometrics to sign you in automatically, and your biometric data never leaves your device. It enables single sign-on for on-premises and cloud resources. It's an enterprise-grade asymmetric key pair authentication model, but it uses a strong two-factor authentication, and you can have multiple accounts per device, for example. For flexibility, convenience, and cost, we recommend you using Microsoft Authenticator mobile application. Microsoft Authentication also supports biometrics. It supports push notifications. It supports one-time passcodes. And it's also free to download from the Apple and Android app stores. We also have FIDO2 security keys. These are now supported, and these are available from several of our partners. And it's really important to note here that many customers, there won't be a one solution that will necessarily cover all the business use cases. And for many customers, they're finding that a mix and match of all our passwordless offerings, it works best for them. So the goal here is to minimize the surface area of passwords within your organization as much as possible, which is why you should leverage all the technology available. We are also working on the problems surrounding passwordless authentication, including the tough question of how do you onboard a user into a passwordless world? Well, we are now going to public preview for what we call TAP, Temporary Access Pass. So TAP is not a general authentication feature. TAP is a mechanism meant to be coupled with corporate processes in exceptional cases, such as accounts recovery and remote onboarding. As an example here could be an employee's first day at a new role. And once the manager is sure that he or she is talking to the right person, then he or she can release a TAP to the new hire. So temporary access passes are now in public preview. If you haven't checked it out, I do recommend you do so. So this is a way that someone like a manager or a security officer can give an employee a one-time code, and then they can use it as a bootstrap to get into a strong passwordless authentication. So the next pillar that I want to talk to you about is using least privilege access model. So this is really important because if you follow the least privilege access model and one of your identities is taken over, then it can only do a small number of low risk things because it only had permissions to do a very specific job. And we know that attacks are getting more sophisticated, but so are the environments that you have to protect. In fact, hybrid and multi-cloud architectures, they have become the norm. And the number of identities that access cloud infrastructure, they have increased exponentially, especially non-human identities. All these identities, they need permissions to authenticate to other machines and digital services to perform automated configuration tasks and maybe to access customer data. With each workload you deploy, permissions multiply, which increases your attack surface. Thousands, if not millions, of complex digital entities now have virtually unlimited access privileges, and some may even have more permissions than administrators. You have to keep in mind that unfortunately, over time, if you don't manage your identities well, what happens is that you get this big creep. Gradually, over time, an identity can do more and more things. So maybe a person changing jobs, they move to a new role, you don't remove some of their old privileges, or it's an identity in software and the developer just keeps adding more and more privileges to it. You get this huge creep. Then all of a sudden, you got way more risk in your system than you needed, and you lost that least privilege access approach. So how do you minimize risk? You do so with security and access policies that follow the zero trust principle of least privilege, and with policies that stay consistent across your different cloud environments and your on-premise infrastructure. This is why earlier this year, Microsoft acquired CloudKnox. So CloudKnox tackles the least privilege access principle in Zero Trust by minimizing account privileges. And their unique technology helps organizations manage permissions for all types of identities across all clouds. Our traditional identity governance and privilege access management systems, they're great for on-premises, but when you extend to cloud workloads, they start to struggle because they're simply not designed for the cloud. And today, very few tools can address complex security and compliance environments across all clouds and on-premises. So it's time to reimagine the way we govern and protect identity and access, and CloudKnox is really a critical piece of this vision. We are removing silos to deliver a one integrated cloud access control solution. This integrated solution combines identity provisioning, lifecycle management, workflow automation, permissions management, and analytics for all your identities, all your resources, all clouds, and on premises, so that you can enforce zero trust access controls everywhere. So there was a session on Ignite a few weeks ago that they talked about CloudKnox. If you haven't seen the Ignite security videos yet, I recommend you do so. These have been recorded so you can catch up on demand. There will be more announcements on CloudKnox next year. So our engineers are currently busy working on the integration with Microsoft. So keep an eye out for new content on this topic. Another tool that will help your zero trust journey is Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, used to be called MCAS. So SaaS applications, they form the backbone of daily operations for many organizations, and keeping them secure is really more important than ever. The problem is that most organizations, they don't know all the cloud apps that the employees are using. Some of these applications, they can be fairly risky, while others may simply not be compliant with the regulations that you're trying to observe. Defender for Cloud Apps is a native CASB solution, so it's a cloud access security broker, and it allows you to discover and control the use of shadow IT. Shadow IT means systems deployed by departments other than your central IT department to work around the shortcomings of your central information systems. So in every organization, there are always applications that are used by employees that the IT departments, they haven't approved, and most likely they don't even know anything about it. So Defender for Cloud Apps collects detailed information about all your SaaS applications in use across your entire organization, and it aggregates everything into a single console. It helps you discover and identify cloud apps and services used by your employees, and then it helps you evaluate the risks of discovered cloud apps, and then you can take action by sanctioning, tagging, or blocking these applications. Another thing that is key to point out in our CASB solution is that it doesn't only apply to Microsoft Cloud solutions, but it also provides you the same level of security and use cases to non-Microsoft Cloud services for things like AWS, Google Cloud, Salesforce, Dropbox, and it does that by using API connectors. With Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, we can monitor the user session within AWS or Google Console, for example, and we can apply policies. For example, we can block upload of suspicious code to an S3 bucket. We can block upload or download based on content for data loss prevention. So let's say you may have a highly sensitive project document that you don't want anyone to share. You can block that document from being uploaded to a cloud app. And Defender for Cloud Apps, it requires an E5 license. So the last solution that I want to mention to help keep your identity safe is Microsoft Defender for Identity. It only takes one account to be compromised for the attacker to establish an entry point. And attacks like password spray, they are still remarkably efficient. So there is an account without multi-factor authentication enabled, and it has a password that can easily be guessed or it is susceptible to brute force attacks. Once that account is compromised, then attackers leverage that user's identity to look for opportunities to discover and enumerate groups with privilege or VIP users. Then attackers would then attempt to compromise those secure accounts, those VIP users, to access and exfiltrate company resources. Together with Azure AD, Identity Protection, and Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps, Microsoft Defender for Identity helps to protect identities both on premises and in the cloud. So Defender for Identity monitors and analyzes user activities and information across your network, such as permissions and group membership. Then it creates a behavioral baseline for each user. It then identifies anomalies with adaptive built-in intelligence, and it gives you insights into any suspicious activities and events that may happen within your network. Defender for Identity uses proprietary sensors to monitor organizational domain controllers, so it can provide you with a comprehensive view for all your user activities from every device in your network. User access is often the first priority for Zero Trust because it quickly brings productivity benefits and security in your key areas. And measuring your user risk, it requires analyzing the risk of the account itself and the risk of the current access request session, whether they're using MFA, for example, whether they're using a compliant device. And we can use Azure AD, Identity Protection, to analyze the user account and the current access request to provide risk rating to your Azure AD conditional access. You can also use multi-factor authentication. We highly recommend, we can't emphasize this enough, use multi-factor authentication to protect your sensitive applications. And then device risk. We measure device risk by explicitly verifying whether that device is compliant with your organization's policy. It uses signals from your endpoint devices for threat detection and response. So we use Microsoft Endpoint Management Intune to provide management of device security policy and evaluates the signals from Intune from your Microsoft Defender for Endpoint clients. And we've got Azure AD conditional access. It evaluates the signals that it gets from your Azure AD identity protection and from your endpoint, and it gives you a score of low, medium, or high. And this score is passed to Azure AD conditional access. And conditional access evaluates these signals against the policies that you have configured. And this combination of static policies and dynamic real-time information, it gives you that adaptive approach to managing risk that is consistent and is continuous using your changing real-world conditions. So after explicitly validating the user and the session and the device risk, let's say maybe low enough, then you may want to grant access to your resources. And also, it doesn't need to be all or nothing. You can allow partial access. You can, for example, restrict access to aspects of your application or your data. For example, you may want to block download from managed devices or upload even, or you may want to block print files from a SharePoint site if that score came back as median, for example. And you can enable session monitoring. Microsoft Cloud App Security can monitor your sessions and it can restrict functionality within your sessions using session policies. For example, if you have a very sensitive project that you don't want anyone sharing, you could implement a content inspection policy that will block the upload of any document that makes reference to this project to any SaaS application. Or you can implement a policy, for example, that blocks suspicious code from being uploaded to a storage account or to a OneDrive. So this slide summarizes what Microsoft Security has to offer to help customers implement a zero trust security strategy. And you can start with a very simple configuration using, for example, only Azure AD that will give you single sign-on, strong authentication, conditional access. Then you can add more security layers to your solutions. Microsoft Security Solutions, they are extensible and we've got multiple layers of protection. So the more layers of protection, the more opportunity we have to detect escalation of privileges and a better chance we have of restricting access to people that we don't want to give access to. So this slide is just for you to take away and have a look at these links, and that will give you a bit more information on zero trust and how you can implement zero trust in your organization to protect your users and protect your data. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Luciana. Thank you very much for that. I just wanted to add a word there as well about, for those of you who are not familiar with Cobweb, we offer multiple services in this area through security and tenant reviews, which are pretty fundamental to the status and protection of a company. We're fortunate within Cobweb that we've got some pretty impressive PS people within our PS professional services group, and including Oliver, who couldn't be with us today for the reasons that I've said because of the dreaded COVID. But Ollie has been an MVP, which is a terminology within Microsoft, on more than 10 occasions. So we're in a very strong position to carry out the security and tenant reviews, which underpin virtually everything that we've just discussed. Questions, I believe. Does anybody have any questions?
We've got one here that says, if we have Linux endpoints on our network, can these devices still be protected with Microsoft Defender?
Yes, absolutely. You can use Microsoft Defender to protect your Linux devices as well.
Excellent. Excellent. Another question we had that sent through earlier, someone that could attend, was, does the identity management affect the end user experience tool? I think they were worried it might slow it down more.
I think when you implement identity management, it depends how you implement it. That's why I said, we've got multiple ways of implementing passwordless and multi-factor authentication. So in most scenarios, you won't have like a one way that fits all your users. So you need to use everything that we've got available. So a mix and match approach, I think it would be best. Some users might be using, for example, Windows Hello to use multi-factor authentication and authenticate your apps, which is certainly the most convenient way, because they don't really need to do much. They open the laptops, they look at the camera, and then authenticate automatically using the biometric data. So it is a mix and match, and we have very comprehensive passwordless authentication that you can use. For example, for administrators, you may want to implement something like FIDO2 keys that they can use to authenticate to their administrative apps, the highly sensitive applications. So we do recommend you to have a look at all the solutions we have and decide which ones fits the best use cases for each of your user groups.
Thank you. One more question we got. If a company has a large influx of temporary workers, would that be hard to manage in the Zero Trust framework?
No, you can certainly implement that. We have something that we called entitlement management. So you can create, for example, access packages for your users. So if these temporary workers, they regularly need access to a defined amount of resources. It might be they need to be members of certain groups. They might need access to certain applications, and they might need access to maybe specific SharePoint sites. You can create an access package for these users, and you can create approval workflows on top of it, and you can use access reviews. So you can make sure that these accounts will be decommissioned as soon as they're no longer required, and they're not just going to be forgotten and live in your environment forever.
Thank you. One other question we had sent in was, is passwordless authentication available for all M365 licenses?
Yes, passwordless authentication, yes, it is available for everyone.
Fantastic. Was there any more questions?
I couldn't emphasize enough, how important it is to use passwordless authentication and multi-factor authentication, because it will give you, 99% of protection against identity attacks if you just enable multi-factor authentication. And you would be surprised of how many companies still don't use this feature.
Wow. Michael, I'll hand back that to you then to sign off.
Indeed. Thank you very much. That last exchange there about passwordless being available on all licenses, I have to admit, was something I wasn't familiar with. I think that's extremely useful. For most people on this call, having to constantly change passwords just drives me around the bend. I can't imagine I'm on my own. I just want to say thank you very much for coming to us today. Thank you to Luciana for a very thorough and comprehensive description of what's available. And as I mentioned earlier, should you have any requirements that we can help in terms of security and tenant reviews, we have the people, the will, and the time to be able to do it. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.